Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. I'm Mary Shirley, and today's guest is Monica Lopez Reinmiller. Welcome, Monica. Please tell us about your background and experience.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I've been a listener to the podcast and was very fortunate to meet you in person at a compliance conference last year, and I was tickled to meet you in person because I've been following you and Lisa on LinkedIn, so I was grateful for the opportunity to join you today. My name is Monica Lopez Reinmiller, and I am currently Managing Corporate Counsel for the Legal Compliance and Ethics function at T-Mobile USA. My current role is primarily focused on supporting the legal compliance function as an attorney, and so I have various subject matter expert roles that I play for the company, and I could talk about that in a minute. But the other part of my role, my job, and kind of the background is focused on supporting the ethics side of the house, in particular the ethics program. And so I tend to be the attorney who supports the program, supporting my senior director, my chief compliance officer, for things like the governance structure of the program, meeting DOJ and SEC standards for an effective compliance program, which many of your listeners are familiar with, the hallmarks of the effective compliance programs and those guidelines that are put out, at least for U.S.-based companies. I also support many of the ethical activities and program pillars that include ethics and compliance policies. I'm the attorney that does legal reviews on those. I support all of our trainings, and so I perform legal reviews of everything from the code of conduct training to conflicts of interest, anti-corruption, trade compliance. I'll even support some of the harassment training that is baked into our code of conduct, along with our labor and employment lawyers and any of our additional subject matter experts that focus on things like investigations and whistleblowing. I'm one of 4 attorneys in the department at T-Mobile. And so, again, my focus in the current role and background is very specific to program and to my subject matter areas, which right now include Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and trade compliance, which is primarily export and OFAC sanctions for the company. So I'm the only attorney that focuses on that and performs the workload, but I obviously have a lot of support, both colleagues within legal that I work with across the board, especially transactional counsel. And within my group, I interact obviously very significantly with both my managing attorney, the person I report into, as well as my colleague.
Probably one of the biggest portfolios I've ever heard someone have. That's incredible.
It can be. It stretches you. And I think one of the reasons I landed in this role, I kind of take a step back and you asked a broader question around my experience, and it's stretching over 10 years when I think about the compliance roles in particular. And I've had various related legal compliance roles in the beginning of my career. And I won't go that far, but really for the last 10, 12 years, I've been focused on legal compliance and ethics. And I've been very fortunate to have people that have given me the opportunity to not only plug into a bigger team, as is the case right now. We have at T-Mobile, we're very fortunate to have, a strong, very diverse team that comprises of both attorney and non-attorney professionals leading the compliance program. But in other roles that I've had, I've been in smaller groups and led them as director of compliance, and I've had to design and implement a program from scratch, which was an incredible learning opportunity under the guise of a very experienced compliance professional. I've worked for attorney and non-attorney leaders, and all have taught me so many things and have really refined my skill set. And it's a space, as you know, it's a space you're constantly honing your skill set. There is never one point in time I think, where you kind of stop and you feel like you know it all, or you know it enough. I've had the experience of not just having different roles and being in leadership and contributor roles, but I've also, I think I've been really fortunate to be in different industries, and the different industries have really pushed me to understand the scale of compliance and how to interact and build relationships, which are so critical. Whether you're kind of a, one person army of compliance, or you're part of a larger team, the scale of the organization, the complexity of the organization, the logistics and the footprint all really factor in how well you need to function in your role and how effective you can be as the compliance subject matter expert or leader or part of the program team. So automotive, chemical, telecommunications, and tech, it's all taught me an incredible amount of perseverance and skill set in this space that we like to call ethics and compliance.
In terms of where you see an intersection between the various subject matters that you've worked in, what's the commonality for you?
If I think about just the subject matter that I focus on as an attorney, the most common elements are transactional in nature. You think about if you're at a consumer product company, everything from the sourcing relationship through the sales. And one very common space that I find myself in from a compliance professional perspective is how do you manage the third-party relationship? Third-party relationships have been in the hot seat increasingly, my sense is, really after the data protection and privacy issues, really blew up with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, where there was this realization that third-party interactions, third-party relationships, third-party transactions could have very real effect on consumers and product and company, everything from reputational to actual potential harm that is measurable to a consumer. If you're not careful where a product or a sourcing material is coming from, and for example, if you're producing something that's been distributed or sold, if you're not careful about the types of materials or the parties you're dealing with, and you are baking essentially that component into the end product that then causes harm, frankly, you play a part in that. You, the company, has a duty to the consumer to do your diligence and to have standards met to ensure that you are not only meeting the mission and vision and the consumer expectation and exceeding the consumer expectation, which as a product company, I think everyone wants to do. So you need to be really, really mindful of the fact that you have a duty. And it goes even beyond just safety and, the health. You owe a duty to your employees to not harm them in the course of doing all of that. And it's really a very involved thought process when you think about it. You can sit, and most of us don't have the luxury of sitting and thinking. That is probably, if I have to say one thing about my role and the depth of the portfolio, which we talked about at the top of the interview, it is broad. It stretches me, but I love it. I would have it no other way right now other than I wish I had more time. Time is is a luxury most of us in compliance don't have. But regardless, I think the taking time to think and to identify the risk in the most logical way and to build relationships and talk very transparently and very directly about how to control, mitigate, and protect. Again, not just the company, but think about all the stakeholders. You think about the consumer, you think about your communities, you think about the employees, right? I mean, it is really sometimes the thing that I think as compliance professionals, again, time being a luxury, that we don't have enough time to sometimes really think about. And I find that the most effective way to cover those things isn't by me doing it. You couldn't possibly manage third-party compliance at a company the size of T-Mobile, and likely you face similar challenges.
Yeah.
The the complexity, the scale, depending on what your company does, one person alone is unlikely to be able to manage it. So you have to be smart. You have to think through, where could these risks live and breathe? Who do I talk to? And how do we get there together? And to the extent where you have the conversation, you get comfort or you get assurance that there's controls, someone else has got it, quote unquote, I got it. Then you take a step back and you just periodically monitor to make sure that nothing's changed and that there is that consistent assurance. And with third-party compliance or third-party diligence, the scale of the operation can be really challenging. That is fundamentally right now probably the biggest risk phase that I feel I am most challenged by in the industry that I'm in, the administrative, just the complexity of the organization and all the different business units that factor. At T-Mobile, I am very, very, very fortunate to have a third-party risk management team that's led by an experienced woman by the name of Susan Bry, and just totally name-dropping her here. She would be an amazing guest for you and Lisa at some point. If you're wanting to talk real third-party risk management, because the program that they have built is, in my opinion, leading class. My background and my experience, I've led diligence programs that were primarily focused on the sales side. We never really got back. We talked about the complexity of third party, from the sourcing all the way through. Third parties could also play a sales role. And, you kind of see the trade, compliance, import, export, sanctions. Who are you dealing with? Are they sanctioned party? But then you flow all the way through and you think about your distribution model. If, again, you're a product company, and the third party on the sales end can bear just as much risk as the front end, with respect to that. And then it kind of shifts from your export, import, safety, sourcing, and sanctioned party risk to then your FCPA risk and fraud, potentially, if you're not careful about who you're doing business with, who is distributing your product, in different parts of the world, let alone in the U.S., because it could just as much happen from a domestic perspective than on the international scale. So therein lies kind of the thing that I focus on probably the most on the legal side, and the commonality I tend to find, at least on the pure compliance, in the pure compliance sense, and how that crosses over into not just really my legal role, the legal hat I play, but also the ethics side of the house, some of the policy work that I focus on for my organization, for my management team, which includes, for example, the supplier code of conduct, which is very much a code of ethics that's focused on third parties.
That's great. And I'm fully aligned with everything that you said there. To be cute, I guess, third parties are high risk, to paraphrase, such a big problem, and therefore you've proportionately dedicated your time to thoughtfully considering where are all those touch points with the third parties and what are the different risks that they present to your company.
The only thing I'll add is I didn't touch at all about, I threw up the Facebook Cambridge Analytica, but I did not even touch on privacy and data protection, which is a whole nother subset of compliance and a risk base that requires dedicated subject matter expertise. And that's one of the beauties of the program I've seen built at T-Mobile. I can't say enough about it because they've taken the time to build a very skilled team that not only evaluates the standard things I would look at, or that I frankly depend on them to assess, which is around sanction and export and FCPA risk, but also the data protection and cyber aspects in dealing with third parties. So it's a very emerging area that I'm sensing a lot of companies in the wake of that major issue that Facebook had to contend with, that they're focused now on the realities of data and third-party arrangements that impact data at their company.
I was just going to ask about sanctions. So we saw a while back that ZTE had a big sanctions case, and in more recent times there have been prohibitions on dealing with Huawei. How have you grappled with those risks involved in partnering or avoiding partnering with such companies?
Well, I think it's the reality is it's twofold. One, I'll point back to the diligence. You start to see smaller parties and or different parties approaching the company, and it's not just my company. This is probably happening all over the world, where you may have affiliated operations that, for better or worse, they're the potentially Huawei or ZTE or affiliates. They're just trying to survive, right? They're an ongoing business concern, and so they're out there. And for us, the reality that we had to buckle down and look across our third-party base and any new party that's approaching the company that may have ties, we've had to really focus on due diligence to ensure that they are not affiliated with any current sanctioned party. And so there's a diligence aspect that has taken, additional time and focus just to, again, continue and make sure that if we're going to have dealings with particular foreign parties, that they are in fact not affiliated with them. I think the other aspect that's kind of developed or resulted is my communication and coordination across other compliance or legal functions, in particular, believe it or not, our government affairs team. And the monitoring, right? The monitoring of the development of ongoing legislation that affects our operation, in particular the supply chain. This administration took aim, quite frankly, at these parties. 2 years ago, last year, the Huawei entity list update happened around May, I believe, and it set off a little bit of a chain reaction in the wireless industry, not just from a sourcing perspective, but everything from the 5G standards bodies work and how our engineers interact with global 5G colleagues, things they're talking about, the types of information they're exchanging. All of that took a different turn when that happened, and we had to take really stock of what was being discussed in meetings and assure that we were going to continue to have that engagement, but also give very specific guidance to our organization, in particular our engineers. But suffice to say that the focus on supply chain affected quite significantly our industry, and we had to take very specific and close measures to keep in touch and understand how things were developing, how the rules were coming in and affecting everything from, again, the supply chain through an executive order down to the prohibition of Huawei and ZTE and a handful of surveillance companies, for example, coming out of the National Defense Authorization Act, which required a federal acquisition regulation certification that equipment was essentially not a part of the supply chain to the federal government. And for companies like mine that are considered government contractors, essentially we sell to the government, that took a very specific, turn from the standpoint of evaluating the existing supply chain and assurances that things were clear in the supply chain, and then that ongoing, there were obviously controls in place to avoid those things. And so there was this kind of sphere of just developments, again, in the legislative side that led to us being in more constant communication with the teams that are in DC. We're very fortunate that we have a very, very advanced, dedicated team sitting in Washington, DC and interacting with these committees that are developing and monitoring all these different legislative activities. But it wasn't just them. It was also our engineering teams that we were starting to develop more communication with, as well as the attorneys that were advising them, because these prohibitions, these developments weren't just touching on 2 or 3 different agencies or regulators. I mean, this has now kind of crossed from the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, to the FCC, which had a specific rule that they issued around USF subsidiaries and the prohibition of equipment from Huawei and ZTE in order to receive those subsidiary monies, to the National Defense Authorization Act that I mentioned, and now us waiting on the supply chain rules coming out of an executive order from late last year. So it's just been a sphere of activity that we're having to monitor for, in addition to really, hunkering down a little on the diligence with foreign parties. Mm-hmm. Slightly long-winded answer to a very simple question, I think, but it's taken quite a bit of work and effort to really keep on top of everything and stay focused, because it's a very dynamic environment. It's a very dynamic marketplace. Mm-hmm. And with what's happening now in light of the virus affecting industry as well as supply chain and logistics, it's going to make for a more challenging environment, I'm sure.
Right. And ZTE now has an FCPA investigation. So do you consider that there's a nexus between managing sanctions compliance risk and anti-corruption risk in regards to third parties?
To the reality of what you expect from your suppliers. And by that I mean just the very basic code of ethics. The very basic know who you're doing business with, and the type of party that they are, and what role maybe they play in the marketplace from the standpoint of not just abiding by laws, but even just are they an ethical company? We've at T-Mobile, we've been so fortunate that for I believe 11 years, maybe 11 plus years, we have achieved the world's most ethical company designation. That isn't a rubber stamp for any of the companies that achieve that. It's a very strenuous kind of submission process, but also very, very detailed. And I think they take quite a bit of pride and time in evaluating the criteria of the companies that submit. But so much of that is a reflection of how, not just how ethical the company is, but who they engage and who they do business with and how they treat their employees. I mean, it's the whole picture of doing right by your community and your customers and your employees. And so I say that in light of, it goes back to fundamentals of, well, an FCPA, a company that may be found guilty or may settle an FCPA charge may not eventually end up on, for example, the Treasury SDN list as a sanctioned party, quote unquote. It is still a reflection of ethics and whether you, as an ethical company, could or should be doing business with them. And it's not to pass judgment by any stretch, but I do think it points you back to the basics of your supplier code of conduct, your third party code of conduct. Are they meeting those standards? And if they're not, whether they're a sanctioned party or someone, potentially found guilty of a corruption violation, then you do really need to kind of assess, then are you living by your own code of ethics? And if not, then it's going to pressure you, or you're going to feel the pressure to really reconsider the business decision to continue that relationship potentially.
I agree. And I think it's a really important point that you make, that just because you have not uncovered in your due diligence, a massive red flag, there may be other things. And one of the easiest ones for me is taking a look at Glassdoor and just seeing if the companies that we want to get in bed with, if they even treat their employees right. Because if you are partnering with someone, you want to make sure that they are holistically ethical, not just that they don't have a reputation for systemic bribery. or flouting sanctions laws. So that's one thing. And another is that you've mentioned the supplier code of conduct. And I'm surprised at the number of companies who, given the nature of their business, may not have thought to delineate between their own code of ethics for the company, but then also a specifically tailored supplier code of conduct. One of my favorite ones is the McDonald's one, which was, if I'm not mistaken, put in place in 2012. So it's a really long time where companies have had an opportunity to think about putting something similar in place, and yet many still continue to rely on their own code of conduct, which frankly is written for a completely different audience, and then sending that to their suppliers and saying, "Hey, y'all, will you sign this for us?" and say that you agree to it and understand it, and so on. So I think that's a really important point that you make. A couple there. One is it's not just the big smoking gun red flags that we should be concerned about. We want to know that who we're dealing with is not just selectively ethical, but that they really live those values. And secondly, thinking about your suppliers really thoughtfully in terms of whether you have adapted your compliance program to suit that particular stakeholder that you deal with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, it's again, time, right? It's the time to focus on these things and to be thoughtful. And all the while, I hate to kind of phrase it this way, but, not being disruptive to your own operation.
Of course.
I mean, certainly, hey, we're all there to support whatever ongoing concern or effort or operation, whether it's, for-profit, nonprofit. The work still needs to get done, but that's not to say, you're often playing kind of the conscience of the organization. And even amongst my legal colleagues who have the tendency to boil things down into how material, quote unquote, something might be, I have those conversations a lot. I'm not there to have a materiality conversation necessarily, understanding that those types of things play out in litigation context, enforcement activities. I'm very aware of those factors, but regardless, it is oftentimes about if you are not being thoughtful and having the conversation irrespective of some financial, assessment you're trying to make. One, you're not living by your standards, as you just kind of summarized. But two, you might be, undermining your own compliance program, which is, I go back to my role as someone who supports kind of the effectiveness of the compliance program, and certainly think about in terms of if you're not minding these standards, or I hate to say it, choosing to look the other way. I can't imagine it's going to fare well for you and, any kind of evaluation that a regulator might make. They are, I've dealt with a handful in my career, and they are amongst the sharpest and smartest lawyers, which, not surprisingly, many of them end up in-house as compliance leaders, but truly it's because they know how to get to answers, and they will uncover to some degree that if you were not living by your standards and there were business decisions or communications that were being made contra to what you hold out to your standards to be, very likely they'll uncover it. And that will not, as I said, bode well in light of you putting forth any kind of argument or representation that you are upholding an effective compliance program. So something to think about. Again, and it sounds a little bit of a defensive posture, and I don't mean it to be, but if you're there and part of your role is to stand up an effective compliance program, then taking the time to be thoughtful about these supplier issues, that is not a luxury. That is something that really we all have to do in the course of a day, a month, or whatever happens, whether you're dealing with a hot issue or just in the course of your program. It's not something any of us could afford to kind of, take a light touch on.
Absolutely. And I think some of the things that we've talked about are considerations, and people might find that, let's say, the supplier code of conduct is not quite right for them. They've got other controls in place instead that they think are absolutely adequate. It's always risk-based and proportionate and tailored to what is right for your company. But I think the main point that we're making out of this is that you've got to have shown that you have thought about these particular third parties in light of who they are and what they do for you, and ensured that it's not just a one-touch, the one-size-fits-all compliance program, even within your own compliance program. So that the different third parties that you're dealing with, the risks that they hold are receiving the compliance attention that they deserve. And it's going to look different for different companies, but there needs to be that paper trail, that evidence that you have thought it through.
Yeah. I mean, we could probably spend a whole hour just talking suppliers and supplier code, but can't help it. When you talk third parties, inevitably it comes up. And if you, I'm sure we could find many of our colleagues to come onto your program to talk about how they manage and enforce and, not just enforce, but really how they live and abide by not just their own ethics standards, but how they inspire and uphold the standards for their third parties and suppliers. That's such a big space that I think it, very well take time to just focus on that for an entire, because you think about it, it's not just a document. Mm-hmm. Many companies train on it, many companies and communications. I mean, it's almost like a mini program in many respects, depending on the scale and complexity of a supplier base. So it would be very fascinating to hear from leaders on just that one topic. It's very rare that I go to any of the conferences or CLEs and hear just on that one item and what people are doing with it. I'm, compliance nerd for me, alert for me, but it's because it's one of the things I work on and have worked on for so long, and it has such an impact on the work I do. I would love to hear from leaders on how they're managing it. I think I'd learn a great deal from it.
That's a great idea, and I love that. I'd love it if we could pull together a panel and I could fangirl McDonald's. So if anyone is listening and they know of someone who works in the McDonald's compliance area that can speak to that topic, please hit me up. I have been a big fan of that particular supplier code of conduct for a long time. I think it's best practice in many regards, but I also like it as a specifically tailored to suppliers. So look out for that. I'll work on an upcoming episode to tackle that topic, because as much as I've talked about being, say, surprised that people haven't given it much thought, that's not necessarily to say that I've given it the right amount of thought either. So it'd be great to get on some real experts in that area who have made big inroads and are leading the pack. So thank you so much for the suggestion, Monica. I'll get right on that.
Sure. Happy to.
So working with third parties like vendors can also trip conflict of interest risks, whether you're dealing with trade compliance or anti-corruption compliance programming. And I always think that conflicts of interest are one of the trickier areas for compliance, because there's really only so much that you can do in terms of automated controls, for example, that we can put around payments to third parties and so on. In the area of conflicts of interest, it's possible for employees to just not be open and upfront about certain relationships, whether it's with a vendor or based on a personal relationship like a spouse or a partner. I know that you've worked hard on a Conflict of Interest 2.0 program for T-Mobile. What are some of the risks that you've sought to address, and how did you strengthen your program in this area?
Yeah, sure. It's, it is a tricky space because so much of it is driven by disclosure, frankly. It is, a large part of a disclosure-driven process. Someone needs to be aware and understand the risk for them to even either raise their hand and come forward if it affects them or involves them, or frankly, even from kind of the investigative aspect to observe something that may not look right or may present a conflict for the company and or for the individual that could impact the company. And if the person hasn't come forward, frankly, for them to report it as a concern to the ethics line. In our case at T-Mobile, the reporting line is called the integrity line. But I think if I think broad stroke, what did the kind of the updates look like? First and foremost, I'm part of a mini team that worked on the 2.0. I cannot take really much credit, though I focused on a particular area for this whole program. I have two colleagues in particular that manage the disclosure process day to day. But between us, I think the biggest advancements were three. One, working on a small team, and not every company has that luxury. Again, I'm part of a larger team. It's the first time I think in my career where I have so many colleagues that are experienced and leaders within their own right. And so when we come together, we collaborate very effectively because we understand the program structure, we understand the expectations, we understand the risk. With that said, we came together and developed a escalation matrix for all the different types of disclosures. So that was one kind of improvement or one thing that we focused on for 2.0, because depending on the type of disclosure, the handling could be different. One, to your point, someone has to come forward, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it really, once the disclosures came in, we wanted to have a flow, a workflow, because some represented higher risk to the organization than others. Some were just standard risk involving employees and outside interest, whether they were on a nonprofit board or had an outside business. And so there were things that were lower risk and scale that still needed to get reviewed and assessed properly in order for us to understand whether a conflict existed according to our policy. And so we worked on a matrix that provided a flow between us, and depending on, again, the type of risk that it represented to the company, we allocated kind of the workflow and the assignment, and that really helped cement not just kind of how the disclosures were being analyzed, but also the consistency and the guidance being given to the employees that were coming forward. I, as the attorney in the group, and I was the only attorney kind of looking at it from a legal perspective, the legal lens, I don't have the tendency to get assigned much outside of two. I get C-suite disclosures due to the confidentiality and sometimes the nature of what's being disclosed. They get assigned to an attorney. If I wasn't in the role, probably would be a colleague. But there was a decision made to have an attorney handle them, to put a very strong legal lens on it. And if it's not something that's high risk, it could be that we're having conversations with the team about it, but there is a certain level of confidentiality that we wanted to apply to it. And so those tend to make their way to me. Executive level disclosures, I will, depending on the team's, questions, what it might be, I will probably see them, but I don't get assigned for purposes of analysis. But I get all the board related activities because those present certain competitive risk, could be depending on the type of company it is, whether it's public or non-public. If it's a charitable nonprofit situation, I'll delve into certain questions around fundraising activities and their role. And so there's this very specific kind of legal risk and analysis that's performed around those. And I'll get into, that's probably the third element I'll get into when we talk about the 2.0 program. But if I think about the next element that we focused on, it was training and awareness. Our director, John Phillips, has spent a number of years really focused on how to improve the training for conflict of interest year over year. And he's really done such a tremendous job because year over year we refine it, and we try and include very current, relevant examples, as well as use internal information as really just kind of case studies, so that it kind of hits home for the managers and employees that are assigned the training. We include at a high level information about conflict of interest in our code of conduct training, which was also revamped. And so I think overall, the individuals that lead our training content and training strategies have really, in my opinion, done the most to impact the conflict of interest aspect of our program and how to really manage that risk within the employee population. I think it's really, I've seen in the 3 years I've been at T-Mobile, I've seen an improvement. It's not just content and material, but I've seen an improvement in the understanding and awareness of the employee base. And I think that that's in large part due to the focus on training and awareness. The third and final aspect of 2.0 was a focus very specifically on board activities and board disclosures. Over the course of 3 years, I really had to take a step back and really build kind of a mini process just for that. And without over-engineering it, I thought long and hard about the realities that board activity, even in a nonprofit space, could pose disruptive risk to the organization depending on the person's role. They have access to certain information. They may be making decisions about procuring certain things or authorizing certain activities. So if they're sitting on the board of a vendor, for example, that can be problematic. Right. If they're sitting on the board of a competitor or pseudo-competitor, that could be problematic. If they're sitting on the board of a public company, I don't know that is automatically as problematic, but something we have to evaluate, because from a fiduciary duty, you think about someone who owes a very specific duty to a public board, to any board, but to a public board in particular. It's, you have to pause and think, what does that mean for your day job? How is this going to affect your role here? Could there be conflict between the decisions you're having to make as a board member for whatever organization or industry you're in, and what your role might be at T-Mobile, for example? And so it's a little bit of an intensive review process, and we don't have too many, but I did have to start looking at them very specifically, and I developed a questionnaire process, and right now all of those get handled by me, an attorney, in particular, again, for all the reasons I mentioned, but also to provide as clear guidance as possible to these individuals to ensure they understand the expectation and the policy around conflict of interest. We've also had to consider things like renewing the analysis, for example, depending on where a person may sit board-wise in an industry or particular company. Companies don't tend to be static. And so year over year, while in year one of board service, that company, for example, may not be considered a competitor or was not a vendor company, by year 3 or 4, they might be. And so you have to consider not just the one-time review, but the ongoing monitoring of these higher risk, or what we have classified higher risk conflict of interest activities to be managed.
That was great. That was really interesting, and I'm sure a lot of people have got some new ideas as to what they might think about next in terms of upgrading their conflict of interest program after your sharing of thoughts there. I'm a big fan of reverse mentoring, which is the idea that someone who traditionally in the workplace would be a mentee has become a mentor to someone who would usually be teaching them, in terms of the actual subject matter. For me, I've gained a lot of experience and tuition from colleagues who may be less experienced at compliance and the workplace generally, but who are more tech savvy than me by a factor of approximately 8,000. What have you learned from reverse mentoring, and how has it helped you to be a better manager?
You need to think about it in terms of not age, not generation, but really in terms of innovation, quite frankly, being fearless. And on the reverse mentoring, I think what I find most often exciting and appealing isn't maybe that the individuals will be more tech savvy, for example, although I probably struggle the most at home right now with the scenario we're having, working from home and the tech challenges I'm having. But by and large, I'm fairly tech savvy and I keep up. But it's really the bringing in of new ideas and the opening your mind up to someone who just is coming with diversity of thought, regardless of what generation or age. The fact that you're talking to someone new with a fresh perspective, and that you are very capable of learning from others, regardless of the walk of life and level of experience. And so for me, I approach this reverse mentoring in that notion of, what can I learn from them? How can I make something better? What ideas do they have? If you approach someone with that opportunity, you'd be surprised. And I'm very transparent with a lot of these types of conversations. I would probably say, I'm looking to get this out of you. I want to learn this from you. Here's why I am asking, right? And it usually doesn't put people off. I don't think it comes across in any kind of threatening manner. But you'd be surprised how I think when you are that open and transparent, how both of you can learn from it. And oddly, I think while it's reverse mentoring and you're looking for them to kind of feed into your thought process and your learning and your knowledge, the actual giving them the opportunity to do that, I think is even a form of mentoring. It's almost like this, two-way street that you're creating with the mentoring. People need opportunities, not just to mentor, but really to kind of shine and to be on a platform and to have opportunities to teach people things. And so anytime I have the opportunity to lift someone up, I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
And I, again, I didn't want to focus on generation, but I have an 11-year-old and I look at this younger generation and I have so much hope because they tell you, they are extremely transparent. They will tell you exactly what's what. They do not hold back, and they don't stand for, substandard answers, information, representations. They just won't stand for it. And I love that. I mean, they really do give people hell. And it's scary and fascinating. I don't know. I'm becoming my mother, but I will tell you this. It gives me so much hope. And that's what I tell young people. I have the opportunity to go to the law schools and the MBA programs around in the universities in Seattle. And I'm so open about it. I tell people, you have so much to teach. You have so much to do. Don't hold back. Give people hell. Be transparent. Don't ever hold back. Teach me something. And their faces light up. It's incredible. I love that reaction. It's not fear. They're not afraid because they're new or they're just starting out. They're excited. And so I really, it's a satisfaction I get to know I can provide that opportunity or, lift someone up and watch them just go and make their way and make their mark. It's an incredible feeling.
I couldn't agree more. I'm also a big fan of letting people have their time in the sun. Not only that, but actually giving them that platform and helping them to get an opportunity. And it sounds like me, you value directness. And I firmly believe that being direct and being candid, but with the utmost respect for those around you is it's an incredibly efficient way to work and to live, because I think it reduces the chance of there being a miscommunication or a misunderstanding between people. So I love that you're really open and transparent when you approach someone about an opportunity that they might be able to afford you to learn, and let them know there's no catch or there's nothing to be suspicious about that I'm asking you to teach me something. I genuinely want to learn because you have something of value to give.
Yep. You have someone motivated and knowledgeable, they're going to go for it. And, you know, if they do hesitate, I think for many of us, we're experienced enough to sense it or to detect it. You can still help. And you just come right back and say, how can I help you? You need my help with this? I want you to drive this. Here's some things to think about. And I mean, you can prod and you can prompt without having to micromanage. There's just no, you know, there's many ways you can do that. You know, and you can take things back, or you could just tell someone how to do something. But I don't think that you'll achieve the reverse mentoring if you take that approach.
Great. And on the topic of those who might be greener in compliance, what's one thing you know now that you wish you had known when you started out in this area?
Oh, wow. I think about all the things I didn't know. There's so many. I mean, I think if there would be one thing to focus on, honestly, it'd be the value of relationships and communication, just purely from a compliance perspective. You can work on the substantive piece. You can study the Department of Justice, you know, guidelines on an effective compliance program, and you can go to all the CLEs and conferences and hear all these wonderful speakers, and you will learn a lot. But the one thing it won't teach you is how to navigate the waters in your own organization and building those relationships and having communication. So much of compliance, I think, is about maintaining relationships in the pockets of the company or the organization so that you have your finger on the pulse, but also you are serving as a support and as a subject matter expert, because you'd be surprised the more you have conversation and ongoing communication with leaders or with certain subject matter experts in the areas like procurement, supply chain, sales. They may not be calling you every day, and you may not be having, you know, ongoing extensive meetings, but they'll invite you to their all hands. They, you know, through conversations, whether it's through issue management or just basic outreach, and frankly, sometimes even remediation of certain things, or just general reaching out and awareness around, hey, there's trade compliance policies that could affect the business line, doing some outreach. There's some information I want you to have. Being able to pick up the phone and having quick conversations, they will come to understand the nature of compliance and the purpose of it, even at a high level. And so many times, as a result of that, of the relationship and the awareness and understanding, however basic, I've had leaders or managers call me, right? Pick up the phone and say something, we're changing. And it's not always about, I'm concerned something bad's happened. It's sometimes just, oh, we're thinking about doing X. I'm wondering if this will have any kind of effect from a compliance perspective. Those are the types of conversations you always want to have up front. One, it really does enable compliance to be at the table, quote unquote, right? However small the decision, however large the decision. But two, it really kind of cements your role from a compliance, you know, program perspective as a preventative kind of mechanism to ensure that the business has guidance, and not that you're making the decision for the business, because that's a trap that I think, you know, from a being green perspective, you know, if there's Roman numeral number 1, relationships and communication, and sub A, I would put under that is, you know, not making decisions for the business and minding that as a potential trap. Those are probably kind of the two biggest things I wish I knew or understood or was more aware of. And I would have focused more on it earlier on in my career, because there is a difference between giving guidance and interpreting and providing the analysis and the direction and probably frankly enforcement if there's already something that has standards in place. But I think the reality is the business has business leaders, and they're there to make the business decisions, and you're there to enable them. And giving the support and the guidance is so crucial, and it will result in building the relationship if it's done right, in my opinion.
You have some lovely substantive ones there. I have a really basic one which touches on our last two topics, which is that in my naivety earlier in my career, I always assumed that feedback must only be given by the more experienced person to the more junior person. And I wanted to give a shout out to one of the fresher members of our department, Julie Barsha, who's really strong at what I'm about to espouse next, which is the idea that just because you might be more junior in a department, it doesn't stop you from being able to give feedback to those more experienced than you. It always, in my mind, was that if someone was, for example, doing some public speaking, that they would know that they do a great job. They're the expert. That's why they're up there. However, there is nothing preventing a more junior person from telling someone after a talk, even someone who's very experienced, that they did a great job, that the talk was compelling, that they learned something from it. And so one thing that I wish I would have started doing at an earlier point is sharing positive feedback, praise, and letting people who are more experienced than me know how their subject matter expertise or their approach or their way of simply doing things had a positive impact on me.
That is such a strong kind of leadership skill and insight to have. I just, again, looking at, without, thinking about age or level or title, you have so much to kind of learn from each other. Whenever I've had the opportunity to present and I get feedback, especially people that come up to me, I'm always wanting to know, well, what do you do? And what's your role like? And because I just naturally kind of go there to want to know about that person and what they do, because I'm thinking constantly, what can I learn? Not to be, wanting to get something out of everyone, not at all, but it's, I can appreciate someone giving me the feedback, but in turn, I can say to them, you are doing this every day. You have knowledge. No matter what level you are in it. And I'd like to know more about what you do. It's always, there's always something to gain by opening that door, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Monica, you referenced earlier us all being at home right now. We are recording this episode during the enforced COVID-19 hibernation period, and this episode will air while many of us are still in that period. Parents across the world, I guess, are uniting in terms of the common problem-solving issue that they must address right now, which is how are we going to make households function when many of the adults in the house have full-time jobs and are expected to continue with those. I think most of us in compliance are in that position for those with families. And yet you also have childcare duties now, which you most likely didn't have before for those of you with part-time jobs and not already working at home. And also there is an expectation, or I guess most parents will be invested in wanting to ensure that their children keep up some form of education and knowledge gaining while we're in this period. How have you sought to, with your husband, address this new workload that everyone is coping with? And how have you thought about keeping your children educated and entertained at the same time?
It's, wow. It seems like it's the same but different for everybody. In our household, and I have to kind of just say, frankly, it's been such a busy, 5, 6, 7 years in particular, that my daughter, who's now 11, has grown up watching me on the conference calls with the laptop getting toted onto, to vacations. And it's by no stretch because frankly, I'm that important that I have to be on all the time, but it's because the nature of the work has to be responsive to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. And in roles where I didn't have, or, while my role is very broad right now, there's people, coworkers who manage training and who are very dedicated subject matter experts in all these different pillars. Whereas in other roles, I was managing the whole thing. It was quite a bit. So my daughter's grown up watching me work this way, live mm-hmm. this way. And this has taught me how to appreciate the little things that went on during her day. Mm-hmm. Because every day I woke up and would get her off to school. And yes, we did not see her. She was in childcare until, the better part of the evening. And then we, like many families, she has activities after school or in the evening. So it was very often that, day to day, we spent about a couple hours during the week together. And I think it's made me really take a step back and slow down a little. The work and the capacity and all of that is still there. But I'm really appreciating, especially as she's getting older, what her day looks like now and how to help her get through it, given that she's herself having to live through a disruption. So that said, with respect to my spouse and myself, I mean, it's kind of divide and conquer, right? I'm fortunate that I have a supportive husband, and between us, we're able to manage the day. By and large, her school district took a little bit to organize the classroom, the virtual classroom meetings, and the work, but it's getting better. And so over time, it's improving, and she's a little more engaged directly from an academic standpoint, but we are still having to kind of fill her day to keep her busy, to keep her, and not just busy work, but to keep her engaged, right? And learn from something, whether it be an art assignment or a book that I found. I had very early on in her childhood purchased books whenever we traveled, and even if they were for older grades, I still kept it. And so I've been giving her reading assignments. I found quite a bit of support online, as I suspect many parents have, free web classes or sessions on everything from science, which could be really, really fun. You see professors and teachers out there recording experiments and talking about like a lesson in a fun environment where she's watching it on like a YouTube, to free camera or, photography classes. That was the newer one where she could take my camera and go outside and, watch a YouTube from a manufacturer, and that were led by experts, by photographers, professional photographers on how to take certain pictures and lighting, and she's done that, and she's written a little bit about it. And so it's run the gamut. And I think the only way, other than split duty, at least with my partner, my husband, the only way to think about it is to kind of prepare in advance, especially over the weekend, think ahead of the types of activities that might be engaging and fun and helpful, and yet they could still learn something from it. And then look around your house to see what you may have available that they may have not have already gotten to, whether it's a puzzle or a book or some kind of other activity that could kind of keep them again engaged and learning for a period of time. It's probably, to be honest, the only way I've kind of kept a certain pace with her, in addition to the school providing the classroom instruction and the assignments. So far, so good. We'll see where we are in another couple of weeks. I'm hopeful that we can keep this up. I think she has enjoyed being with us more, but it's certainly challenging times. I think most kids miss being out of doors and amongst their peers, and from a social aspect, this has been one of the harder things, I think, for most of the children we know, including her.
I really liked the point that you made at the beginning about appreciating some of the smaller things that have happened to her. I guess as adults, some of the things that we perceive as being very small, that could be the highlight or the big deal of her day. So I'm glad that you've made that insight.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, that brings us to a close today. I wanted to wrap up with a couple of the key takeaways for me from what Monica has shared with us. And the overarching theme would be tailoring, which I know we tend to keep in mind anyway in compliance, but now thinking specifically about some of the hints that Monica has given. So in respect of your suppliers, do you currently have a supplier code of conduct? Have you evaluated whether one might be helpful? It's okay if the answer is yes and the answer is no. You've evaluated it and that's not quite fit for your purposes. But then what are your other controls that you have in place that are specifically designed for that risk set? And then thinking about your conflict of interest aspect of the program, have you considered your board members as being a special group, and what have you done to address some of the unique risks that they might have? So thank you so much for Monica. I got a great deal out of this. It was really interesting, and I appreciate your precious time and thoughts today.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for leading these podcasts. I look forward, as always, to listening in to your new speakers, and thank you, and Lisa, for taking the lead on not just publishing this, but in our network as women, and more so as compliance professionals. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Monica. That's so kind.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.